All right, I think let us get started here. So, first of all, thank you everyone for joining our webinar here today. My name's Jason Woodica, pronouns they, them, and I'm going to be discussing with Don Gannon Jones, VP of Content at Carrot, how to build engineering interviews. It may be a reasonable time of morning, but it's still a new mouth. So, we're going to be talking about how to build engineering interviews in the age of AI. But before we kick that off, I want to go over the agenda for today and a few quick housekeeping items. First of all, we are planning on talking for about 30 minutes and then take some time after that to answer any questions from you all out there. So please share your questions using the Q&A system. And if you see questions you like in there, upvote them. That'll help me know which questions to ask Don. This webinar is being recorded. We'll be sending out that recording tomorrow via email to everybody who signed up. And finally, this is the final installment in our three-part series on AI and its impact on technical hiring. So we will, in that email, include the previous two webinars so you can watch them as well and learn everything that we've learned. So now, with that all out of the way, please join me in welcoming Don Gannon Jones. Don, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Always good to be here.
So to set the stage, we have been talking through the previous two webinars about how AI has impacted technical hiring. And we covered it from the engineering leader perspective. We covered it from the talent acquisition leader perspective in the second one. And we've got a different perspective today. So Don, as I mentioned, you are our VP of content. And in simple terms, what does that mean?
It means my team is responsible for creating all of our interview content. So the questions, the coding exercises, the discussions, as well as how those are scored.
So that means this perspective, I think, is going to be, from my perspective, the most interesting. That's why this is the one that I wanted to get to interview you for. This is where we're going to talk about how we are building content and the research we've been putting in to make sure that the interviews we're building are effective in this age of AI content.
Yep.
So I really want to get that expert view. And so that's going to be about how to structure interviews, what to do, what not to do. And I think some of the key stuff I want to make sure we cover is what are those core competencies you should be interviewing for, how you should be structuring your interview to get that really strong confidence signal and what the candidate's actually capable of, and where do AI tools and competencies around AI fit into this whole process. So to start off with, Don, what do you think is the core competency in the age of AI, as folks are calling it?
I mean, for software engineering, it's not changed that much, right? So here's the analogy I've been using. Way back in the day, we built cars by hand. Fine. We wanted to be more efficient, produce cars faster, more consistently. And so we got computers, robots, machines. But we couldn't actually have the machines build the same cars. We had to redesign the cars themselves so that they could be built by machines, right? That means you couldn't rely on a human's ability to get their arm all the way up sideways around you had to build it a little different. Well, software engineers have always had a role in software design and architecture, and they're still going to have that role. If we know going into an application that we're going to have AI writing bits of it for us, we have to design for that. We have to plan. Maybe that means writing smaller services so that when the AI produces code, there's less of it for us to review. It's a smaller scope, smaller bounded context. But I mean, maybe software engineers are no longer needed to write the login dialog box that we've all written 50 times in our careers, but I think most of us are willing to kiss that goodbye and do something more interesting.
If I never wrote another one of those, I'm not going to complain.
Ever. So I mean, I think that's largely where we're going to see a lot of the efficiency gains is in the boilerplate kind of low level, what I call scut work. And we're going to reserve human brains for things that human brains are good at, creating things, architecting things, designing new things. So I think a lot of the core competencies are really the same. If you're a Java developer and you really aren't familiar with the tools Java offers for running in highly scaled, concurrent, multi-threaded environments, AI is not going to help you get better at that. And AI is not necessarily going to be better at it. Like if you don't know to tell it those things, then it's not going to know either. So like we still have a really strong role in understanding what the business needs, what the operating environment's going to be, what code is needed. Do we need to write every single line of code? No, but when it comes to interviewing, hopefully you weren't interviewing people with the idea that you're only going to watch them write a couple lines of code, right? Hopefully you're elevating the conversation a little past that.
So that actually brings up a great point, which is we want to talk about how to structure interviews. How do we make sure that the interview is actually covering not can you put some code together that it'll run, but can you take a problem and write the correct code? Can you solve a problem?
Yeah, so unfortunately, a lot of folks are not professional interviewers, which is fine. If you were hired to be a software engineer, be that. But we ask those folks to be interviewers, and we ask them to put together interviews. And interviewing is a science. It's a cognitive science. And there are entire fields of science around that. And if you don't know those things, it's easy to make a lot of mistakes. The shortcut I use is called Bloom's taxonomy. It's something you can look up. Wikipedia has a pretty good article. There have been a few revisions of it over the years where they've changed some of the names on things. But the bottom level of Bloom's taxonomy, meaning the least thinky thing you can ask a human being to do, is to recite facts, just to spew off facts. What are the 6 types of software tests? That is something that AI is going to do really well because it's a huge web scrape and that information is freely available. But also when you ask that of a person, like, who cares? Who cares if they can recite that information if they don't know what it means?
Yeah.
So the next level is comprehension. And that might mean me asking, tell me the difference between a unit test and an integration test. Also, not really predictive of a solid employee at the end of the day. Just because I understand those 2 things doesn't mean I can put them to use. So a better one, this is more application in Bloom's taxonomy, might be, hey, we want to make sure that we're checking as few bugs as possible into source control. What type of software test would be most appropriate for that particular use? That's where you really want to get into it. So the higher you can bring that cognitive level, application, analysis, the more you're really going to be finding someone who's got the brain for the job. Maybe don't test them on syntax because we can look that up. If someone can Google something in 5 seconds, it's not a great question. Because on the job, we're all going to Google everything all the time. If I need to look something up, I'm going to look it up. All the frameworks we use are ginormous. I can't remember all the time. It's better for me to look it up because then I'm probably going to be coding more accurately than if I remember it all out of memory and forget that, oh, I've got that decorator in the wrong position, or I've got, that parameter backwards. So elevate the conversation. Look at Bloom's. You can find lists of verbs, and each set of verb ties to a specific level of Bloom's taxonomy. And if you see yourself asking questions like list, that's knowledge. And that's how you know you're doing knowledge, is because that verb falls into the knowledge. So start looking for other verbs that elevate the conversation.
If I'm remembering correctly, you put together an article that kind of summarizes some of that as well, that we published.
Yeah, I might have.
So yeah, we can maybe try to look that up and share that link out with folks as well, because it is a great resource just using Bloom's taxonomy that way. Something else I really do appreciate there that I think I've seen come up in some of our questions is that when you elevate like that, it's not necessarily about the right answer, but it becomes about a right answer. I know at least one of the questions that I've asked, there's multiple answers somebody could give that we would accept if they justify them. There are still wrong answers. There's still things like, that is not the right way to do this. But there's 3 or 4 different approaches that all will get you there. And we just want to know that they do have one of them.
Yeah, sometimes asking folks, giving them a short scenario, and then saying, instead of asking them, what would you do? Which is a really common approach. It's, all right, here's a scenario. Our business, we're Netflix, we do streaming videos, blah, 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 blah. We're concerned about scale when we go international. So what we've decided to do is stand up a bunch of AWS buckets in every region and put all of our content in every region. Can you walk me through some of the pros and cons? Can you tell me why it might work, why it might not work? Can you, what sort of other ideas would you suggest? Because you're looking there for analysis and evaluation. Those are very high cognitive things. Looking for someone to look at a situation, think about it, understand the pros and cons, right? You obviously don't have time to give them the complete layout of all of your business constraints, but to know that someone can be like, well, it might do this, it might do that, this might be bad. You might also look at a CDN instead, like it could be cheaper. It could create less operational effort if you just pass that task off to a CDN. Those are the types of things you really want to walk through with someone, because it shows they know the shape of the thing. They know the breadth of the thing. Now, if you then just said, okay, do you know how to deploy something to a CDN? Not a good question. That's knowledge.
Yep.
And I could look it up. Like anything that can be easily looked up, a series of tasks, anything like that, not the best interview approach.
And just if I'm recalling correctly, we actually in our interviews, we allow folks to look that stuff up during the interview to kind of help to keep us honest of if they're going to be able to look it up, if that would mess up our question, well, we know they're going to be able to look it up, so we'd better not ask.
Well, to connect it back to AI, we have some interviews with some customers where we allow use of generative AI. In fact, there are some customers where our interview environment might surface a chat GPT window or something like that. Because if that's going to be a real world productivity tool, then the interview should be about, can you use real world productivity tools? If on the job, I'm not expecting you to write every single line of code. If on the job, I'm expecting you to use AI to write some lines of code, but then I want you to evaluate that, make sure it fits. If it needs to be restyled into our style, take care of that, like all those things. Those are legitimate things that a business might decide to do, and you want to interview on that. The real key is really understand what's needed on the job and ask questions and have discussions about that. Don't just do trivia questions about Java. Really focus on the key of the job. Why is there a human being in a chair punching away on a keyboard? What is the essence of that? It's rarely captured in the job description, which can make it tough. Job descriptions tend to be checklists of tools and technologies we want you to know, but really get at the heart of what that human being brings in value and try to focus the interview around that. It's one of the reasons that I don't think building an interview in the age of AI is particularly different than it was before we had, generative AI. If your concern is that someone's just going to have a chat GPT window open, type everything you're asking them real quick, and then get an answer to read off, they weren't good questions.
I think that might be the real challenge of the age of AI is not that it changes what a good interview looks like, but that it is going to expose what bad interview practices we kind of were doing all along, and we now need to stop because we actually have a tool on the table that reveals just how ineffective they were.
Yeah. And if look, if your company wants to do the kind of FANG style algorithm and data structure coding exercise, be really clear with the candidate that we're doing this because I want to see you work through the problem. Maybe I don't even actually care if you write the code. Maybe the syntax is not the most important thing to me. Walk me through how you would solve this problem. And because I want to see that you can grasp this data structure that I've put in front of you, and you can think about, okay, it's a jagged, grid. Am I going to iterate? Is this a hierarchical thing that I'm going to have to do a recursive function to call back because I'm going to continue to find more folders rather than files, let's say.
Yep.
So it's really about that. And then you can say, okay, you know what? Write me that recursive function. What would that look like real quick? It's 20 lines of code, maybe 10. That lets me know you can code. It lets me know you can translate that concept that's in your mind. That's what I'm really after. I don't necessarily want to see that you can write a bubble sort because no one writes bubble sorts. The way we sort is array.sort. Everyone knows that. I just want to know if you can logic your way through it so that when I present a far more complicated business problem to you, that you're going to be able to logic your way through that too. But be clear with the candidate that that's what you're looking at. That's what I'm after. I don't need you to use AI for this because I'm really not just about the code. I don't care if you can write a bubble sort. You're never going to do that. What I want is for you to walk through it with me and make it more of a discussion.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, it feels very obvious when you put it that way. And I think that's possibly one of the strengths of a good interview is it isn't necessarily that, it's not that complicated, though it's hard. There's work that goes into it.
Yeah.
So before I move on to the next question, I just want to remind folks who are watching that we do have the Q&A feature. I would love to take some of your questions and ask them to Don. So just go ahead and pop them in there as we're going. We'll have some time for that at the end. But while we're working on that, I think one thing I'm wondering here from a lot of the stuff you're saying with these higher level questions in Bloom's taxonomy, these questions that get more at the thinking, how do we make sure that it's not just you wondering whether the candidate's going to guess the way you would solve it? How do you make sure that you leave room for the candidate's options to be different than yours?
Yeah. Again, it's pulling back a bit. The less specificity you create in the question, the more room you give someone to answer. So, maybe a real quick example. If you're writing a question and in the question you're explaining something, you went too far, right? That's what you want the candidate to do for you. So, if I've seen someone do, hey, so when you're in a highly concurrent Java environment and you're using such and such an array to maintain thread concurrency and thread safety and everything else, right there, you've gone too far. Like,
Yep.
you've explained how the language works. Bring it back a bit. Say, what is the problem? Don't give me a single bit of the solution. Don't talk to me about your approach. Tell me the problem. And leave yourself open to multiple answers. Make it clear to the candidate that, look, there's no one right answer here. Give me a couple ways you would approach this. One of the benefits of humans over machines is our ability to ideate and our ability to go in multiple directions. That's really valuable, and that's a valuable thing to have on a team. The more you constrain someone to one and only one correct answer, the more you remove your ability to see if they're broad. Like, I would never want to ask a question, let's say it's a high-level architecture question about a cloud application, and I was trying to get at how someone wanted to architect microservices. I would never force them into, Amazon Lambda. I would never force them into Azure Functions. I would just say, here's the business problem. What are some ways you might approach this? If they came out and said Azure Functions, I might come back with, cool, what if we're a hybrid cloud company? Because that's going to tell me, again, it's about breadth of thinking. Do they know the shape of the thing? Even if it's a lower, more entry-level position, maybe a quality analyst who's working with Selenium in Java. A straightforward is, what would be the Xcode or the XPath query to get to such and such an element? Elevate it up a bit. This is the bit of code we need to look at. Here's some of the raw HTML, very simplified for the interview purpose, obviously. How would you go about making sure a particular value wound up in here? Oh, I would write an XPath query. See, now they have to come up with that information. They have to think about the process. They have to think about the procedure. That's what you're after.
That makes sense. And I presume also then, if there is something other than, say, XPath that they could use, you can then evaluate that answer, even if it's not something you were familiar with.
Yep, be open to that.
Yeah. So one thing I want to look at here is, we have these AI tools that are appearing. You mentioned that we are sometimes conducting interviews where candidates are allowed to make use of them. What are some of the ways that you see using them effectively?
Yeah, it's going to depend a lot. I'm not hugely a fan of ChatGPT as a particular generative AI for producing code, for example. It's been trained on a little bit too large of a model.
Mm-hmm.
That model has a lot of errors in it. Like, the content in the model has a lot of bugs and errors. And I don't know for a fact if it can tell the difference. I've certainly seen it go off the rails a few times. Where I see AI being a useful productivity tool for developers is in writing the scut work code. Like, if I need someone to write a bubble sort, I really should be using AI for that. It's been done 100 million times, but you have to select the right tool. Copilot and GitHub could be a better tool for that scenario, because it's been trained predominantly on code and predominantly on working code. So I'm more likely to get something out of it that I don't have to spend a lot of time fixing up.
That is a great point too, that the working code in the training set versus just any code in the training set.
Yeah. Like, as much as Stack Overflow can be a wonderful tool, there's also a lot of jerks on Stack Overflow. Like, we've all run across it. All of that's in the model. And so I never know where the model is going to go. It feels to me like asking AI to take a reasonably sized business situation and then stubbing out, maybe, okay, what are the key microservices that we would need to write? So we can start to, and not as an answer. I think something a lot of people miss about it. Humans are problem solvers, but we need to encounter a problem before we can encounter a solution. And a lot of times we need to fail at that problem, right? We need to try it one way and then realize that won't work. Anyone who has ever worked for a tech startup that started with a monolith and then later had to refactor it has been there. And there's reasons all those things happen, and they're not bad. It's just part of the human process. AI can make that faster, right? If I have AI spit out a list of 30 microservices to go with a particular application model, I can now have my team throw rocks at that faster than if I had my team come up with that list and then we all threw rocks at it. And by the way, no one's going to be embarrassed to throw rocks at the AI's answer because it has no feelings.
Yep.
And so we're going to get a really good discussion. It's a great way of putting up a straw man that we can talk about. I think it's going to be a good productivity tool for writing the same functions we have all written 1,000 times. Write the structure for my login box, write my CRUD model for my MVC. It's those types of things as a productivity tool.
I've seen a number of folks use it to build their unit test harnesses, not the tests, but that thing where you're going to set up this entity so that we can then run individual unit tests against it.
Yeah, I've done some playing around with Copilot on giving it a fairly decent sized chunk of code, a few hundred lines, and saying, tell me what unit tests I should be running here. And it does a really good job. And it can even write some of those pretty accurately. It goes off the rails occasionally, but that's fine. Like if it gets me to a certain point, that's productivity. So I think it's going to be a better linter than a lot of our linters. I've had really good success getting it to take some pretty horrific looking code and make it not look horrific while still working the same way.
Yep.
I personally write horrific code. That's what you sign up for if you hire me to write your code, which is why I don't write code anymore. And AI could probably have hid that if I'd had that earlier in my career. So I think as a productivity tool, it's a good productivity tool. I don't think it will replace the thinking. I think what a lot of us get worried about when AI is coming for our jobs is that we actually have a lot of human beings doing some really unenjoyable, low-level, unrewarding work. And some of those positions may become less necessary in the future, which means we need to look at really where the humans add value. And I think interviews should always have focused on the human value of a human being. I mean, we tend to interview, I see a lot of interviews that are a little bit like human unit tests, right? We've had these problems with colleagues in the past, and so we're going to put interview questions in that are designed to stop that from happening again. It's a unit test for people. I call that a fear-based approach. We're afraid of making a bad hire, and so we're going to put up a lot of things to prevent people from getting out. And it's an exclusionary practice. But if you kind of rethink your thinking and say, look, we're not going to try and keep people out. We're going to try and get the right person in.
Yeah.
We're not going to interview with fear. We're going to interview with hope. And I want to build an interview around that. And what do I hope for this person? What do I really, really want from a human being in this seat, and make the interview about that? Then it doesn't change in the world of AI. It's still a very human-centered, inclusionary, welcoming type of, I want this person to join my family. And if you think about it from that perspective, as opposed from sort of the more natural engineering tendency, at least for me, is to make a unit test and exclude people and keep people out and be in fear and prevent a bad thing from happening. If you take it away from, somebody said, instead of betting on the downside, bet on the upside. And then maybe your interviewing should have changed, but AI will have nothing to do with that. It should change because you want to take a more bet on the upside approach.
That makes a ton of sense. So one other question that I've been wrestling with around AI is, of course, we're seeing these new skills. We're seeing this concept of prompt engineering. We're seeing these things that people do with AI systems. And where does that fit into our interviewing process?
I wish we had gotten in front of the phrase prompt engineering, but I guess I have to accept it now.
I'm not a fan of the phrase prompt engineering
either.
I'm willing to take a small digression into why we don't like it.
No. So look, if there's a place for a skill in an organization, then there should be an interview for that skill. If you, for example, work with a large marketing organization and they want to use AI to generate their first drafts of things, I get it. I get how that's faster and cheaper and everything else. And that could make a lot of sense for the company. but you're going to need someone who's really good at dragging that out of the AI. And that's what prompt engineering is dragging it out of AI. We could call it AI whisperer. Um, and if
I'd much
that's
rather have that on my resume, actually. I mean,
AI
prompt
whisperer,
sounds very fancy, but AI whisperer, it's like, I feel like I could get a Netflix series with that.
you could. So if it's a skill you need, then you should have an interview for it. And you should focus on the things about that the human being brings to the table, the thing that makes it important. What is it that we need a person here for? And build the interview around that. If you're building your own AI models, obviously that's a big data science thing. There's a ton of academic background that I would expect someone to have. Ask a lot of questions about that background. Ask about different models. Ask about, this is what we're planning to do. What would some of your recommendations be? And evaluate what they come back with. Because in that case, it's not just their answers. It's the way they deliver those answers. Can they explain it to a mere mortal? Are they concise? Do they get condescending? That would be maybe negative for some organizations. So really think about what are the human values that need to come out of it. I think we're going to see the need for AI skills. That seems like a no-brainer, just like we need internet skills. But let me tell you, this is a good one, actually. So, Microsoft has now wedged AI into every single product they make, as far as I can tell, right? There's a Copilot for everything. Good for them. Feels exactly like what they did in 2003 when they wedged the internet into literally everything overnight for reasons unclear, but that's fine. Here's what we never did as a people, as an industry, as the whole planet, we never did. I have never seen a job interview where someone talks about phishing or clicking links in email. And how is that not a core job skill? I mean, I'm pretty sure I have to go to training every year so that I learn not to get phished. If that's a core job skill, and it's one of only two things I can think we do annual training for, why isn't it in the interview? Like, why aren't we checking for that before we bring people into our environment? So look, AI is going to be the same thing. AI is going to be the clicking the links in the email. It's going to be, do people know the right thing to type? Do they know when not to type? Like, do they know not to paste our code into ChatGPT so that it sucks it up and uses it to train its model? Like, those should all be practical elements of the interview process somewhere in the interview. Maybe not at first screen, maybe further down, but at some point, think about what AI is going to be on a day-to-day basis. Think about how it's going to upset us and start hiring people who have those competencies. Whatever you interview for winds up on the internet, especially if you're a large company.
Yep.
There are websites where people freely share what their interview questions for. Those questions drive people to learn those things. So simply by interviewing for something, you are having an effect on the system. It's like quantum mechanics. By asking the question, you are changing the answers. So if those are things you care about, then they should be in your interview. But I would say this to people. If you're not already asking people about phishing and other types of attacks that you're vulnerable to in your interviews, don't bother with AI either. If you're going to worry about AI, worry about the entire rest of the internet that we still haven't gotten our hands wrapped around. Like, really think about what's a core skill. And whatever you do training on once a year is probably a core skill.
I think that's also interesting. You've kind of given a great example of something that we don't talk about a lot, which is what are things that are important on the job, but that you don't put in your selection criteria, like phishing. Is this going to matter on the job? Absolutely. But we're operating from the assumption that we're going to be able to teach everybody what they need to know on the fly.
Yep.
Well, that's a good assumption. I'm going to leave unchallenged, but we're operating out of that assumption.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen a certain amount of evidence that annual training isn't going to solve all the problems. So, again, what's the human element? What does the human bring? Rational thinking, critical thinking, logical thinking, problem solving. Those are all things that should be built in. I'm less worried about AI taking a job because I think, like robots, I think AI is going to make a lot of jobs easier. I think it may eliminate some extremely low-end jobs, but that's fine. We have tons of higher-end jobs that I'd love to move people up into. I'm worried about when AI becomes an attack point. when it becomes a problem for us, not a problem in terms of job loss, but a problem in terms of we are not sophisticated enough to use it safely.
Yep.
Feels like that should be on our minds a lot.
And we're already at that point with some of the open source systems where, you know, like dependency poisoning attacks, we're already using systems that put code into our systems that we are not properly equipped to use safely. So we're adding another of those points, but we haven't really solved the ones we're aware of.
Yeah, and I almost never see interview questions along the lines of, hey, we're thinking about using this external library. Talk to me. Tell me about it. What you'll usually see if someone asks that is, well, you know, that library is a little slower at this type of an opera, like a really technical analysis.
Yeah.
Not, you know, that library comes from this public repo and no one knows who maintains it. Like it could be full of garbage and we have no idea. So yeah, again, think about what's important and focus that human discretion there.
And that question is, in fact, one that I have asked as an engineering question about packages, and that's one that we have fairly regularly asked at Carrot when we are bringing on engineers, because we at least care about it. So, you know, you can learn from us.
Yeah.
So again, by the way, if you have any questions, please do go ahead and drop them in. I just saw one appear here, but I would love to ask your questions to Don, and the one I've got here right now. So I've got the question, I suppose AI won't replace software engineers, but might weed out bad ones, and you'll no longer need sort of low-level folks who are just kind of doing the code monkey thing to write the boilerplate code. But how can we offset the impact on the economy from effects on unemployment rates from that? So that's an interesting question. I don't think, Don, are you an economist?
Not this week.
Me either, but we'll try.
But I mean, look, we have had, we're sitting at near record low unemployment. At least in the US, I realize that we do not have the highest level of employment participation. So, you know, you can definitely argue about the total health of the system, but I think there's a couple of things there. We in the IT industry know for a fact that we have hundreds of thousands of unfilled positions, and they're not unfilled because people haven't been trying. They're unfilled because the human beings with the necessary skills don't exist in the right framework. Either they don't exist on the planet or they don't exist in a legal framework where I can hire them. Like maybe I can only hire people in the US. So we need to do a better job of directing people to the jobs that exist.
I will quibble with you a little, Don. I think there's a third reason, which is they exist, but the process is being used to find them, weed them out.
That can happen too. Totally.
Which is the one I've been focused on as we're looking at making interviews fairer.
I think so. My LinkedIn feed popped up with a recruiter who was looking for a job or looking to fill a job, and they kind of made a little graphic with their key requirements. And the first one was 4-year degree.
Yep.
And I reached out and I said, "What 4-year degree?" They're like, "Oh, any." I'm like, "Well, then you don't need a 4-year degree." Any is not an answer. If you need a computer science degree, fine, say so. If you need a statistics degree, fine, say so. So point being, if we've got all these open positions and we have human beings, we need to start focusing our efforts not on a one size fits all. Everyone go do this educationally. Everyone go do this educationally. Here is the opportunity. Go educate for that. Software engineers often do quite well, regardless of whether they went to college or not. Most front-end developers I've met didn't go to college. If you need to hire a data scientist to build models, they may have needed to go to college for that. If you need to hire a lawyer, that's college education, no question. Need to hire a doctor? Yes, lots of college, please. The more the better, especially if they're going to see me. But we need to get better at right sizing. I think we will probably eliminate a lot of low-level SWE jobs over the years, but that means everything else is just going to lift up, and we need to be directing people toward those things. If that's non-traditional education, if that's better college programs, whatever it is, we need to size so that the output of our education estate is meeting the needs of the market, not just continuing to pump out people who are suitable for a job that is potentially endangered. We need to be better at that. All the way down to guidance counselors in high school. Stop telling kids that college is the only answer. Look and see what's available, and let's try and I don't have a college degree. I went to Votech, and it did really well for the first huge chunk of my career. It was right-sized for that. We need to just be better at that. We need to look at what's actually needed for the job, teach that, interview for that, and then employ people for that.
Great answer. Got another question from one of the attendees. So let's assume we want to do this. Are there suggestions on how to go about the change management process to implement these reduction in knowledge questions in the interview process? And we have the note of particularly if an interviewer insists on a certain set of questions, which I kind of want to pull out first.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I could do a rant on this. So look, I try really hard in my professional life to never use the word believe. You can believe in Santa Claus, which means behaving as if something was a fact, even though you have no evidence of that fact. So I can believe that a particular interview question does a good job. First of all, define good job. Does it keep bad people out? Does it invite good people in? Does it produce a lot of false positives? Does it produce a lot of false negatives? But if you answer those questions, now you have data and you don't need to believe anymore. And the problem is that a lot of us feel or we believe good about certain types of questions, but we have no proof. We have no data to back it up. What is particularly vexing is that interviewing by definition is not really a good disprovable hypothesis. So in science, you can have a hypothesis and you can start some experiments to prove it, but you also have to do experiments to disprove it. We can't really do that in interviewing because that would require us to have an interview with someone, say, wow, they did really badly. Let's hire them anyway, just to see if our interview is any good. Like, we're not going to do that.
If anyone would like to carry out that experiment, by the way, like,
Sign up.
I'd love to work with an academic team on that, but.
So you need data. You need proof. Particularly dangerous because interviewing is not a disprovable hypothesis. We then have to really acknowledge the massive, huge danger we have of leaving really good, qualified candidates on the ground. We leave them in the pile because they couldn't get past our interview. That is a huge part of why our industry lacks females, lacks people of color, because a lot of interviewing techniques leave them behind. Those interviews are still selecting perfectly good qualified candidates. They just tend to be from the same pool that we already had. So you really, really, really want to look at data. It's tough to do that. It's a little hard to convince someone to let go of their beliefs because data is not always emotionally pleasing. It's not always emotionally convincing. It's sit down as an organization, decide what your values are, decide how you're going to proceed on those values, make some decisions, and then stick with them. Maybe that means having a group of companies in a local area get together and talk about the different questions they've asked and the different outcomes they've seen. Maybe it involves working with a company like a Carrot that has a lot of experience across a lot of industries and actually does a lot of testing and gathering data. We can, because it's our job, we can hire people to take interviews that we don't actually plan to hire on a job, so we can gather a lot of data and disprove that hypothesis. But I think just really acknowledging that just because you think a question is the question doesn't mean it is. Like, you can't assert that without some data behind it. And a lot of us, when we do our interviews, we just don't gather that type of data. We don't track that type of thing. It's a really good question. It is one of the things that winds me up a lot.
In what you just said too, I think a big piece of that change management process that was mentioned is getting folks to start to look at that data. Because if the change management process is about, well, we'd like you to ask something different, we'd like you to do this, and it is just a feelings to feelings process, that can be very challenging. That's organizational dynamics. But getting people bought into the idea that interview questions are measurable, are evaluatable, even with the caveats you just mentioned of, there are challenges in doing it.
Good questions. Good questions acknowledge the existence of cognitive science. They acknowledge the existence of fields like io-psychology and psychometrics. There are sciences around assessment. I mean, that's what an interview is at the end of the day. You're assessing someone for something, and there is a lot of science around that, and you can take advantage of it. So
I've got one more question here, I think, before we're going to run out of time. being able to ask questions that accurately mimic the job responsibilities can be harder for a third party to do. So what techniques is Carrot using to do this?
Ideally, our customers work really closely with us so that we can do discovery and find out what those job requirements are. That might include looking at some of their code. It might include talking to some of their existing engineers, which is ideal, really getting a feel from the people who are already on the ground. What's your day look like? How much of your time do you actually spend coding? How much of your time is in agile stand-ups? How much, really help us understand the realities of the day-to-day job. It can be done in a very formal fashion, which is called a local validity study. And we would work with IO psychologists to do that. That is part of the thing that trade offers. It can sometimes be informal. It can be a hiring manager, or even better, a lead, just kind of giving us a brain dump. It depends. If you're hiring a bunch of people, it's worth doing the structured thing. If it's fewer people, you can do something a little bit less formal, maybe. But we have to ask. We have to find out. We have to ask those questions.
And I think probably one other thing I would just note in that question is we talk about mimicking the job responsibilities. And I think one of the things that we've discovered is that it's not about mimicking them, it's about predicting success at them, which often doesn't look like mimicking them. I'm recalling that research out here.
Yeah. So here's the funny thing. So for a given set of questions, let's say we write 10 questions. And some of them are the ones you're going to believe the most in. Like, you're going to go, yep, that's going to be a good question. But it turns out either a lot of people get it right, which means it's not differentiating between good and bad candidates, and when I say people, I'm talking a cohort that we've specifically identified as these ones are qualified, these not. So we know where they are already. Too many people get it right, it's no good. Too many people get it wrong. Like, the people who should get it right aren't getting it right. That's no good. People across cohorts, maybe men are doing really well on it and females aren't doing it, getting ready to give me a weird signal, don't like it. What you often wind up with are questions that you never would have guessed are good questions. But in fact, when you look at the data, those are the ones that do a good job of being fair, predictable. They're the ones that predict the right outcome, right? They get us the people that we wanted, and they filter out the ones we knew we didn't want going in. And they're fair across those cohorts. They can look weird sometimes. It can be a really interesting discussion with hiring managers. They're like, why would you ask this? We're like, weirdly, because the data says we should ask that one. So yeah, it can get a little weird. It's an interesting science.
Well, thank you so much for all these answers. Thank you for these questions from our attendees. That is all the time we have for today, unfortunately. But I want to thank you all for spending some of your Wednesday with us. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, Don, for being here.
Yeah,